Welcome. This is the Institute on Ecosystems Distinguished Lecturer Series. Each month we have a distinguished lecturer from one of the departments that we interact with in the Institute on Ecosystems. I'm Bruce Maxwell. I'm the director here at MSU of the IOE, and I'm here tonight to introduce Dr. Lisa Rue, who's going to give us a talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly, which will be interesting. To give a little background on Lisa, she has a PhD degree from the University of Reading in the UK. After that, she did a postdoc at, I'm doing this all from memory because I think I know. She did a postdoc at Rothamsted, and also in the UK. That's a famous agricultural experiment station that's been there since 1790 something. Yeah. And then she went to Australia, where when she came here with her accent, she was forever Australian as far as everyone else was concerned, but we knew that she was from the UK. She's a professor in the Land Resources and Environmental Science Department, and she's studies invasive plant ecology, and is interested in management, applying that ecology to management. Her main research goal is to improve our understanding of plant invasions and develop effective, integrated ways to prioritize management at local global scales. She and her students work in a range of ecosystems from crops and rangeland through mountaintops, and have published the results in journals and book chapters, and given papers around the world. She's quite well known in the wheat community, and has done many things. I've interacted with Lisa for 20 years. And so we've shared research projects, and so I know her quite well, and I just can't let her get off the hook without a story. And it was really hard to select what my favorite story would be. It would have just a moderate level of embarrassment, not a lot of embarrassment. But I think one of my favorites that really attests to Lisa's ability to solve problems was once we were invited to give talks in Madrid, Spain. And we were, so we went off to the airport, and we were late, of course, leaving our office. And when we got to the airport, Lisa realized that this was back in paper ticket days, that she didn't have her ticket. She'd given me my ticket, but she didn't have her ticket. And she had made almost all of the arrangements. Most importantly, the person that was going to pick us up, she had arranged that, but I didn't know who that was. And suddenly she had forgotten her ticket. We're ready to get on the airplane, but she doesn't have a ticket, and I'm going off to Spain and have no idea who I'm meeting. And I didn't really realize that until I'm almost to the gate. And Lisa, meanwhile, solved the problem, because what she did is she ran outside of the airport looking distressed, and some guy said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "I forgot my ticket. I need to go get my ticket." And he said, "Well, I'll help you." And she jumped in his truck. He drove her all the way back to the university and said, "Look, the engine's running. I'm going to just let you go get your ticket, and I'm going to drive you back to the airport." It's amazing. So all this is going on. I'm not sure what it's about, but this is where things are going through my mind. Wow, what am I going to do when I get there? I have no idea who I'm looking for or anything. So the best part, though, is still coming here, because she got into the building in Leon Johnson Hall. She runs up to her office and realized, I don't have my keys. And it's locked. She kicked the window on the door of her office to open the door, got inside, got her ticket, and we fled the country. Luckily, because there was a warrant out for her. there was all this big concern about what happened. Somebody must have broken in and stolen something valuable. No one knew what had happened. So anyway, that was a great experience, and it was quite an interesting one. She made it just in time. I couldn't believe to see her walk down the aisle of the airplane when I thought they had closed the door by this time. So it was. I was thankful for that because she knew where we were going. Anyway, Lisa Rue does some very impressive research. Has a great line of research and has continued to move that forward in some really interesting ways. So without anything else to say.
I'm not sure I can live up to that. Whew, I'd forgotten about that story. The best bit was I didn't know Bruce quite so well, so I couldn't tell him about the smashing the window part in. So I got back and we had to fly out of Seattle, and so I had to sort of go off and make a phone call and say, can you get into the lab a bit early tomorrow morning and clear up the mess? Because it was the outside window and it's a safety window, so you're not meant to be able to break those. Turns out to do a good karate kick, you can get through them quite easy. So with that, I better record how long I'm talking for. So this evening I want to talk about invasive plants. And we generally hear about the fact that they're really bad, they're spreading, they're going to take over. Is this mic working? No. No poncho for me. Okay, so invasive plants are bad. They're taking over. They're spreading. We should be very nervous about it, and we need to manage them. And I guess my point this evening is it's not that simple. Nothing's ever that simple. So invasive species themselves, there's some good parts, there's some bad parts, and there's some ugly parts. But when we're thinking about that, we also need to think about our place in that system. How are we aiding them, and are we part of the problem? So that's really what I want to try and go through. And as Bruce said, I've been here a little while. And so the work that I'm going to talk about is really, it's not just mine, it's all the people that have worked in the lab with me, and also quite a few of the faculty that are in here as well. And I haven't been very good at stating that all the way through. So it's an effort of a lot of people, not just me. So the plan for this evening is, first of all, I want to just explain what invasive plants are, go through why we should worry, and then introduce the characters from Montana. I'm just going to concentrate mainly on invasive species here in this state, a little bit about their impact and how we should manage them, and then try and put it all together. So, in general parlance, we tend to use these different words to mean the same thing, whether it's invasive, it's exotic, it's alien, it's non-native. If we're being invasion ecologists, we're going to say that an invasive species is just one that's increasing in density or spatial extent, and it's having an impact. But generally, invasive, exotic, alien, and non-native are used synonymously. But to me, they conjure up really different things. So invasive is something really nasty. It's aggressive, it's doing something unpleasant. Exotic, I always think, oh, that'd be kind of nice. I'd like to go to Hawaii and have a little bit of a swim. And then aliens I don't like. I just think of little green things sticking around. So I don't like those terms. So I'm going to try and use non-native or invasive as we go along. So all of these species, non-native means they don't come from this particular place. They've been brought in from elsewhere. But we have a different group, Noxious Weeds, that I felt like I should really just state. So those are ones that have been designated by federal, state, or local government in officials as injurious to public health, agriculture, recreation, wildlife, or property. So once a species becomes a designated noxious weed, you have to do something about it. So you have to quarantine it if there's not very many of them, or you have to contain them in some particular way. And in Montana we have 36 noxious weeds, and there's 2 different levels. The top level is basically ones that aren't here, or only 1 or 2 have been here and then we've controlled them. And then the rest of the levels are basically increasing frequency or abundance of them on the landscape. And so with that we have decreasing amounts that we have to actually control them, if that makes sense. And then there's 5 that are regulated. And those are ones that are here, such as cheatgrass or Russian olive, that are quite widespread. And you don't have to control them, but you're certainly not allowed to spread them around and plant them knowingly. So the pictures I have here are some of the noxious species. So hound's tongue, Dalmatian toadflax, Canada or creeping thistle, a spotted knapweed, and oxeye daisy. So why should we care? Should I care? If I stand out here, you can't hear me, right? Okay, I'm going to try and stand still. So, why should we care? So, back in 1999, Simbeloff and Van Holle basically described an invasion meltdown. So they said that due to global change, we've got climate change, we've got land use change, we've got increase in populations, and we've got invasive species. Invasive species are one of the primary causes in changing the way that ecosystems are actually working, and can cause this invasion meltdown. So that was their term, and that's where this cartoon comes from. So that invasive species would have more of an impact than climate change. And then Pimental basically said of the 5,000 non-native species that we have in the states, they're all displacing several native plant species. But after that, there were several reviews that looked into this in a little bit more detail. And basically, we should think about the fact that there's a few species, such as cheatgrass, as I'm showing here, that are causing a lot of problems. But there's a lot of other species that aren't having quite so much impact. So this impact that we're talking about, basically, the worry is that native species, whether it's native plants, let's concentrate on them particularly. So native plant richness, the number of species and their composition, how the community interacts with the other trophic levels in terms of invertebrates, birds, whatever, and how the ecosystem processes are functioning, so how the nitrogen cycling, etc., all perform better when there's no non-native species. And then we're saying that if you introduce non-native species, so this is non-native species increasing here, the amount of native species and the way the ecosystem is functioning is going to decrease until we get to this stage down here where we've got an invasion meltdown. So this seems pretty bad. And as a result of concern for invasive species, there has been a number of different laws and acts written. So basically, executive orders then meant that there was a federal Noxious Weed Act, so we had to control noxious weeds on federal land. That led to one that was the Noxious Weed Control and Eradication Act in 2004. So that's to control or eradicate noxious weeds on public or private land. And then states such as Montana developed their own noxious weed control plan, and ours was last updated in 2015. And we developed how we should go about doing it to try and make sure that we weren't having negative impacts on the rest of the system. So there's a lot of concern because they're having a negative impact. There's these laws that say that we have to control them. The question is, how much does it cost? The last estimate was for invasive species as a whole, so that's not just plants, but animals and invertebrates. So their loss or their cost in terms of reducing recreation or yield, as well as how much it costs to actually control them, was 100 billion a year in the US. And then based on previous work, a third of that is likely to be due to be associated to non-native plants. So we're spending about 333 billion a year on invasive species for the impact that they're having. In Montana, we know that we spent 27 million on invasive species control in 2015, and most of that was on noxious weeds. So we're spending a lot of money on it. You could ask from that point of view, how effective is it? If we've been worrying about invasive species since the 1990s or before. We're spending a lot, they're having a big impact on the system, but we're also spending a lot of money trying to control them. How well is it working, and why don't we have a handle on it? So I'm going to try and come back to that in a little bit. But I want to then step back a little bit, and how did they get here in the first place? So there's been 3 main phases of introduction, according to Phil Hume down in New Zealand. So the Middle Ages was when we started globally to do a lot more transportation, and as we're moving crops that we do want around, along with them we get some that we don't. So the Middle Ages, and then just around and after the Industrial Revolution, here we had a blip. And then again, we've had a big increase more recently due to globalization or the Anthropocene. So that's really in this particular scale here. So white here is plants, and then invertebrates are in gray. So plants have been going up steadily over this time, insects more dramatically, and then mammals for some strange reasons are in a very different scale. So it looks much worse than it is for mammals. So the point is, we're moving them around, and some of them we're moving around intentionally, and some of them we're moving around unintentionally. So of these that we're moving around unintentionally, how many are actually successful? So there's this rule called the 10th rule, and the way this works is 1 in 10 of those imported move into the wild. So if you think about, say, 1,000 different species of seeds being brought in on a ship, let's pick a ship, only 100 of them will actually make it to some soil. And of those 100 that make it to the soil, only 10 of that 100 actually become established and produce seeds and have a self-sustaining population. And of those, where was I at? 10. 1 in 10 of those actually become a pest. So most of the non-native species that we're thinking about are in this category. They're here, they're hanging on, they're doing stuff, but they're not what we would actually call a pest. Only 1 in 10 of them actually becomes invasive and is a problem. Okay? So how do they get here, and we've done how do they get here, but how do they establish? So there's a bunch of hypotheses about how they arrive, and being that we're not in class at the moment, I'm not going to go through all of these different hypotheses and test you on them later. But I'll just highlight a couple. So an empty niche. Does everybody know what a niche is? Okay, so everybody's kind of nodding. So let's just do it from the point of view that every plant has a set of environments that it does better in. So a certain amount of soil, it needs a certain amount of soil, light, water, nutrients. So lots of different dimensions, what it requires to do particularly well. So the empty niche hypothesis, I think I might get graded by Kathy and Matt on how well I explain that later, But the empty niche hypothesis is saying that a plant's coming into a new environment and nobody else has those particular requirements. And so it goes, woohoo, and it just explodes and it can grow really well in that place. In contrast, this diversity resistance hypothesis is that if you have a lot of species in an environment, they have a lot of different niches, a lot of different requirements, so no new things can actually come in because all of the different resources have already been used up. And so diverse systems are more resistant to invasion. And then, as usual, Darwin comes into it, and Darwin's naturalization theory was that for a species to be able to colonize, it was more likely to colonize an area if it was phylogenetically more different. So if it was another grass, it wasn't actually going to do very well. But if there was all grasses where it was trying to get into and it was a tree, it was more likely to succeed. So all of that's put together in this diagram here. So this is, think of it as Darwin's niche difference. And then fitness is basically how different the invader and the resident is. So if they're not very different, then the residents are going to repel the new species that are trying to get in. So if an annual grass is trying to invade an annual grass environment, it's not going to work. But up here, where they're very different, if a dandelion is trying to invade your lawn, nobody else in the lawn has the same requirements, so it's going to do pretty well in this particular situation. But I probably just spent too long on that, but we can put it together in another way. So it's not just about the plant, it's about the ecosystem. What does the particular area look like? Is it suitable for the plant that's trying to come in? What are we doing there? Are we causing disturbances? Down here I've got fires come through this particular area and we've got cattle grazing. So we've caused this disturbance that's going to change availability of nutrients and forage. So that's what the ecosystem's providing us with. Then if seeds are coming in, you can't really see, but there's a privet hanging onto the back of this truck here. But if we're bringing seeds in, or there's enough seeds coming in, then they may be able to exploit different parts of the ecosystem here and establish. And then the third part of this is the invader property. So now we've got a picture of cheatgrass again. So if the species that's trying to come in can exploit these unused resources that we have here, because we've got cattle in there, they've walked around, they've pooped, etc. So now we've got more nutrients. There's gaps in the vegetation, so it can exploit that and grow well in this particular environment. So that's how we need to think about plants invading. And now I want to introduce some characters from around here. And I thought as I use this title I should probably actually refer to it. So I don't watch very many movies, but I looked up how old this movie was. It actually came out the year that I was born. So there may be quite a few people in here that haven't actually seen it. It's a possibility. So just a quick introduction to kind of what goes on here. There's three bandits: the good, the bad, and the ugly. And in some situations, these two characters get switched around. And that's important because it's similar to plants. Sometimes we think they're good and sometimes we think they're not. So that error is important. And I guess what we need to know is, this is Tuco, so there's an amount of money on his head because he's shot quite a lot of people and done lots of nasty things. And Blondie comes along, captures him, and takes him in and gets a reward. So he's seen as very good. So he gets a reward for bringing in this dreadful bandit. Except when he's hanging on a noose and is about to be executed, from a distance that nobody can see him, he shoots the rope and releases this character, picks him up, and then they share the amount of money they get. So they do this as a ruse quite a few times. So the guy that's meant to be good, is my point, isn't actually quite so good all of the time. And the guy that's meant to be bad, he turns out to have quite a few good traits. This character, Angel Eyes, he's always just a little bit bad. So the link that I'm trying to do is, it's the same with plants. There's good, bad, and ugly, and that we play different roles in different situations. So good ones are the ones that we rely on every day for food and nutrition. The not quite so good ones, I have a list here of species that we used to think was good, and we introduced them for a reason. So this is St. John's wort, and we brought it in for medicinal purposes. It's meant to treat depression. It's used as a salve. Common mullein was also brought in for medical reasons, but one of the reasons I like a lot, it was also brought in to kill fish. So it was used as a pesticide by people from Bavaria. They brought it into the Appalachia. So they chuck all the seeds in the water, the fish eat them, it makes them a little bit slow, and they come up near the surface and they're easier to catch. So that's one of the reasons it was brought in. The toadflaxes, so we've got Dalmatian toadflax and yellow toadflax. So they were brought in as ornamentals because they look pretty. A fact you may not know is Dalmatian toadflax was actually planted in mammoth so that they could actually put it as nice table pieces when everybody was dining. They don't do that anymore, but that's why it was how it was introduced to the park. And then Russian olive, which we brought in. It's good for soil, to stop soil erosion, and also as a windbreak. But all of these we brought in because they thought they were good. They've now managed to spread out of where we originally planned them to be, or we've decided that we don't appreciate the traits that they have anymore. And there's some other ones that I'm being a bit daring on, that I also think are worse than the ones I've just talked about. Smooth brome, crested wheatgrass, Kentucky bluegrass. We brought them all in for forage and in some cases for soil stabilization, but they've been really good at spreading out of where we've put them we intended them to be, and they do have an impact. But as I say, we brought them in for set purposes, for soil erosion and for forage. So there's quite a lot of species that have these dual roles that we need to be aware of. And I'm including this one, it's not about Montana, but Jordan that works in the lab sent me this paper yesterday and said, it's really good, you should include it. It's like, okay. So this one is Lantana kamala. So in the Himalaya, it's a real problem. It's very invasive along roadsides. But higher up in the mountains, it's actually used for timber, so for fire, but also for building, and it has some additional uses. So there is a benefit from that perspective. And they've more recently found out, where they're doing mining, that not only is it good at holding the soil together, it also has phytoremediation capacity. So if there's heavy metals or lots of particulate matter in the soil and in the environment that you don't want, it absorbs those and keeps them within the plant. So I think it's just a nice example that, you know, it's invasive and we don't want it here, but to other communities and in other places, it's actually playing a much better role. Okay, and then there's the ugly species, the spotted knapweed and cheatgrass. Those are our ones that we tend to dislike most around here. Although spotted knapweed was accidentally brought in, there's also stories of people intentionally bringing in because beekeepers like it, because it makes good honey. So, you know, there's always stories about these things. I don't really know of any benefits of cheatgrass, I must admit. So cheatgrass is known as the invader that won the West. It's invaded a lot of areas, CRP, crops, winter wheat particularly, and we can find it in urban areas. But we worry about it most in rangeland. And even in rangeland, we can find it in a lot of different places, different types of meadows. It's a shame that these photos aren't looking a bit brighter, but so you find it in lots of different environments, and that's the case with a lot of species. But do they do well in all of those different places? So back in, when I first got here in 2000, Bruce and I had a project from 2001 through to 2005, where the Park Service wanted to know where their non-native, noxious and non-native species were throughout the park. And the park don't tend to give you very much money, so we couldn't do masses of sampling. So we came up with a strategy that we would sample from the road, away from the road. So the black is roads, blue is rivers, dotted lines are trails, and Frank is in the audience, so we should thank him for this image because it's his that I've stolen. And then we walked along all of these transects and recorded whether species were present or not. And you can use this information to make species distribution models and also find out a little bit more. Oh, you really can't see that. You can find out a lot more about where the species is growing. So you can make these rose diagrams. So you can have aspect, north, east, south, and west. And then you can have slope, so this is flat going through to 90 degrees. Obviously you don't sample much over about 45. And then these dots represent where we found the individual species. And you can basically add them up and create these kind of maps to show that this particular species obviously likes westerly aspects and southwesterly aspects and a little bit over here in the northeast, but doesn't do too well anywhere else. Cheatgrass really likes the south aspects, particularly 5 to sort of 30 degrees. So that's pretty much optimum for this particular species, but you can find it through to the west. So this, I'm just trying to demonstrate that each species has its own environment that it does better in. And you can use this data. This was the same data that we have. So this is with elevation. So this is cheatgrass here. You find it at lower elevations. By lower, I mean about 6,000 feet in Yellowstone. But as you go up in elevation, it goes down quite quickly. In comparison, Kentucky bluegrass doesn't mind these higher elevations at all. That's why it works so well up in Big Sky, where they've got that golf course. Anyway, so it can grow really well at high elevations, and you can have fun playing golf when there's not snow on it. And then if we come down here, like cheatgrass as well here grows very well in sagebrush, but it doesn't actually invade all these other environments, which if you heard all the rapport about cheatgrass, you think it would grow everywhere. Well, it really doesn't. It likes grasslands and not really anywhere else. Whereas, say, smooth brome does pretty well in grasslands, quite good in forested areas, and not so well in other places. But all of them, this is a disturbance intensity. When there's more disturbance, they all do better when there's disturbance. Who's usually responsible for the disturbance? It's us. So, that said, what kind of differential impact do we have? Dalmatian toadflax again. The red means it really likes it, through to green meaning it doesn't like it at all. You'll find it, but not very much. So Dalmatian toadflax grows closer to roads and trails, does pretty well with elevation. You find it more on the south to west aspects and steeper slopes. But how much impact does it have in those different places? So Fred Polnack was a PhD student. And I should say, it would be nice to be able to do this kind of study on all species, but it takes a lot of effort, and he was with us for 4 or 5 years. So he looked at plant populations from Gardner all the way up to Eagle Creek and Jardine and Mount Washburn. So he had these populations along a big gradient, and what he found was how abundant they were. So this is stem density, how many you find in a per meter squared at low elevations. This is the park though, so this is like 6,000 feet. At low elevations, you only get like 6 per meter squared, but it grows much better at the medium and high elevations. And then same thing here for the number of seeds it produces, not very many here at low elevations, but much more at these higher elevations. And then the question is, does it have an impact? If all these non-native species are meant to having an impact, what's the case with Dalmatian toadflax? So this diagram again, if you don't have any non-natives, everything's going to be great. If you increase the amount of non-natives, it's all going to go to hell. So, what happened? Next. Okay, so this is increasing toadflax cover. So no toadflax, lots of toadflax. Native species richness, so the number of native species went down as we had more toadflax. Conversely, if I press the right button, non-native richness went up. So where there was more toadflax, there was more other non-native species. So they're either facilitating each other or they all like the same sort of disturbed environment. So native species was negatively impacted as we expected. And what happened to diversity? There was no effect on diversity. And on the community level, he looked at litter. So where there's no toadflax, litter is lower significantly than where it's higher. Or where toadflax is, there's more litter. So we didn't do the next step. What this could mean is it's having community effects. So it's changing the rate of nitrogen cycling, it's changing the amount of organic matter in the soil. So there could be a community effect if we looked a bit longer. So Bruce alluded to the fact I've been here a while, and so there's been lots of students and colleagues that I've been lucky enough to work with. And with hindsight, I should have made everybody collect richness and diversity in information, regardless of what the rest of their project was about, but I didn't do that. But we have the information for quite a few species. So toadflax, Dalmatian toadflax I've told you about, decreases native richness, doesn't have an effect on diversity. Yellow toadflax didn't have any effect on richness, neither did spotted knapweed, neither did sulfur cinquefoil, neither did it have an effect on diversity. But desert alyssum, that titchy-witchy little mustard that you've probably all seen and taken no notice of whatsoever, turns out Jordan's doing some work on this, and it actually is decreasing native richness and decreasing diversity. And then we get into these grasses, so cheatgrass, smooth brome, Kentucky bluegrass, all decreasing the number of native species, and in some cases are decreasing diversity. So my point with this is, even for the species we have around here, they're having an impact, but it's not always negative. And this fits with a global evaluation. So Vila looked at studies around the globe. The yellow dots are where they did the evaluations, and basically found that in most cases there was, 50% there was no effect on richness, abiotic properties, so changes in light, water, or ecosystem properties such as nutrient cycling. For community structure, 53% of the time, native plant abundance or arthropod abundance was actually impacted. And then here, 32% of the time, there was increased rates of nitrogen mineralization or decomposition. So my point from all of this is it really does depend, and not only on the species, but where it's growing. And we need to be more cognizant of that when we're thinking about how we should manage them. So, I'm not going to talk very long about management, but in my opinion, it's also a little bit good, bad, and ugly. Generally, we use chemical control. So this is a picture of Jane Mangold spraying. Admittedly, we don't normally do it this way, unless it's a plot. We normally have a bigger vehicle to do it with. But most people use chemicals as their main way to manage weeds. And in situations like we have here, so this is all yellow, it's all annual grasses. You can't see, but I know there's a little native plant just here. So in that case, spraying a herbicide several times, we can't really have very many off-target native plant effects because there's none of them there. But we need to be concerned about that in other situations. But what we do need to be concerned about here is, as this looks like annual grasses as far as we can see, then there's a smooth brome patch through here and more annual grasses. Even if we do control it with some herbicide, what on earth is going to come back? Is there anything left that's useful in the soil? So do we need to think about doing some seeding or some other management? So for cheatgrass, the main herbicide we use is imazapyr or plateau. And this is just really to demonstrate that we tend to think, oh, it'll just work, we'll just get rid of our target species. So this is what happens where there's no control. This is cheatgrass, otherwise known as downy brome, western wheatgrass, and 2 other native species. If you apply the herbicide, we really control the downy brome, whether we apply it just after it's germinated or before it's germinated. But as you can see, we really impact the native species as well. And they might come back a little bit because if they're in big bunch grasses, they have lots of roots, so they can return. But there's lots of situations where we don't think carefully enough about the impact that we're having with our management. We're just trying to get rid of the target species, but we're having a lot of off-target effects. So the way forward is really to use more integrated management, and most ranchers in Montana are already doing some form of integrated pest management. So that's using different approaches. So herbicide is still the main approach, but quite a lot of them also use grazing. That's targeted grazing particularly, so sheep or cattle, put them on when the target weed, in this case cheatgrass, is green and growing in the fall or in the spring before the natives start coming up, and that can knock the cheatgrass back. But in some cases, like I said, if it's been annual or weedy species for ages, maybe you need to bring some seeding in. So this is something that we're working on a lot. I shouldn't swiddle my light around. Good point. Coulter's doing this. He's sitting in the audience. So Coulter is responsible for bringing all of this together. So come back in a year's time, he'll have all the answers for you. But basically, how can we reduce the amount we're using herbicide or use it at a more appropriate time, but combine it with these other methods and also some newer methods like cover crops to actually reduce the pests or reduce the targets that we don't want and increase other things. Of course, it would be much better if we can concentrate more on prevention. So if we want a sward like this, be aware that we should limit disturbance through that area. We shouldn't go driving through it. We shouldn't graze it too heavily. And if we do that, it's going to resist invasion to a much greater extent. And then we could avoid those infested areas when the seeds are shedding, so we're not spreading them around. So in conclusion, I've hopefully showed you there's a scale here, but maybe I should do a test to check everybody who's been paying attention. So the question is, are invasive species drivers? So are they coming in and making all these impacts on the system, and it's them that's doing it? Or are they, in fact, the passengers that are just coming along for the ride as a result of what we're getting up to. And so, in case you don't want cartoons, we actually have pictures. So this is yellow toadflax up near West Yellowstone. So the question is this driving change, or is it a result of the grazing and the logging that we've done in that area, and maybe, whoops, the odd fire that's causing the problem? And like most things, it's not straightforward. I think that invasive species are basically passengers. So we're bringing them in here, we're doing all this stuff that's giving them a capacity to invade. But at the small scale, once they've actually invaded, they can actually start driving the system. So they can actually then change nitrogen rates or decrease the amount of native species. So it's a bit of a scale thing. So pulling this all together, back to our characters, I hope that I've showed that it shouldn't be as superficial as good, bad, ugly, that they all, invasive plants in general, have different roles to play. And we should think a little bit more about how our role in their success, or equally in their failure. So I'd just like to acknowledge a lot of colleagues, maybe not this guy so much anymore, but everybody else, and then all the undergraduates that have helped, and also the different funding that I've had over the years. And I'd like to thank you all very much for listening, and if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Now, along with opening the Northwest Passage, causing buffer crop potatoes to Greenland, good global warming is supposed to discourage the growth of spotted knapweed. To your knowledge, is it true that warming conditions are actually limiting the proliferation of spotted knapweed in western United States?
I could have planted that question. So that's a really good question, and I unfortunately don't have any of the models that we have for that. But the answer is, because I've said, you know, plants grow differently in different places. So as the temperature warms, and here the precipitation isn't going to change very much, some species are actually going to go down in their abundance and other species are going to go up. And Bruce, more than I, has actually been creating models for things like spotted knapweed, leafy spurge, etc. And as the climate continues to change, those species, or spotted knapweed and Dalmatian toadflax and a few others, are meant to actually decrease. But there's other species that are actually going to increase. So it doesn't, yeah, I mean, that fits with the models that we've actually been producing. Yeah.
Who in Montana decides when a plant species becomes a noxious weed, especially if it's a native? And what do you think the best thing or ways that they could do better right now in their management decisions?
So you might have picked up when I showed those pictures of noxious weeds that, well, I only showed you 5, I suppose. Most of them are forbs, so they're flowering plants. So that's interesting to me. And Matt might say, because he teaches people how to do identification, that some of that is driven by the fact that we're all a little bit better at identifying flowering plants than we are at identifying grasses. I should correct myself that Ventonada has now been put on the noxious weed list, so that's a new species coming in, and cheatgrass is on the regulated list, but otherwise it's all flowering plants and a couple of trees. And so I don't know the exact process, but basically different agencies and the general public can partition that a particular plant is having an issue, and you have to be able to show that it's poisonous or deleterious in some other effect. But most of the ones we have are poisonous or deleterious to cattle in particular. So they're going to impact agricultural input if you have too many of them on your land, and the cattle eat too many of them. There's somebody in this audience that I will not name that did talk about actually putting smooth brome and Poa pratensis or Kentucky bluegrass on the noxious weed list, because in many ways we know that they have a really big impact on richness. And if we're worried about native communities and we want to keep the number of native plants, then we probably should be more worried about smooth brome and Kentucky bluegrass than we are about some of the forbs. If I was allowed to rule the world, or at least the noxious weed designation, I think I would want to have a few more studies where we actually look to see, is it actually having an impact where in the different environments that we find it here, and how much has to be consumed for it to actually have impact on yield or a poisonous impact on any animals. Any other questions? Yep.
So you're talking about cattle and how they have an impact on whether something is determined to be a noxious weed. What about common sweet clover, which can have an impact on cattle, and there's a lot of it around here?
Yeah, I think that, so it's not on the list, but then it comes down to, things like smooth brome, yellow sweet clover, we introduced because in the right situation they are beneficial. But yellow sweet clover particularly is quite good at spreading to other places. And this year was a particularly good year. It didn't really matter where you went, everywhere was bright yellow. And it'll be another couple of years because it's a biennial before it comes back. So basically there's a little bit of logic that goes into it. There's no point putting a species on the list that you can't possibly control. We can't control all the sweet clover, we can't control all the cheatgrass. There's just too much of it out there. And there's not, for some of those species, there's not a very good way to control it or manage it anyway. And I think what I didn't say right at the end is that I think we're going to have to get a lot better at living with things than we are maybe at the moment, or it's going to get a little bit more complicated. So we want to increase diversity, so we may not want so much sweet clover, but we might need to think what species we could plant with it that would use up some of that nitrogen, so we could actually then get back to having some more native species if that was what we wanted.
Can you speak to any advances in targeted herbicides?
There's a really good video that I meant to bring out. Yes, this is a joking answer first. But in Hawaii, they wear camo and they actually put herbicide in their bullets. And so in terms of being really targeted, so if they can't actually go through the jungle, it's too complicated, so they stand around on the edges and they shoot at the different species. That wasn't what you were meaning though, was it?
I find that interesting. Challenging.
So, in terms of being more targeted to particular species?
Yeah, the whole idea of, is there some way to take a particular plant DNA sequence and therefore target a particular chemical just into that match? I mean, that's what we've been looking for ages, and I'm just wondering if you have heard of any advances in that particular area.
No.
That was a good answer.
Does anybody else have an answer for that?
Targeted pathogens, right? Sansel tried doing that for you. So tailor the pathogen to fit a particular weed. We're trying.
Okay. Did you hear that?
No.
No, he does a good job of mumbling.
So Dave Sands in Plant Sciences is trying to target particular species by developing pathogens that will target species specifically. So I don't know whether we have any examples of where it's worked, but that's the approach that he's actually taking.
That's a big.
It's a big step.
In its own.
Yeah, but I mean, I think the trouble is with trying to do it on a species specific, so many of you might be trying to target a grass within other grasses. So finding enough difference so that you can target one particular grass, like cheatgrass, when it's growing in winter wheat, is going to actually be very tricky. And I don't think there's been any advances. Tony?
So I was really struck by your image of the toadflax distribution along the roads in northern Yellowstone. So again, along the lines of technology, like how would you redo that survey 20 years on to ask whether there's been spread off those roads?
Yeah, I think it would be nice if we could resample some of the same transects. You wouldn't need to do all of them, but if you could follow, we use GPS, so we could follow where we walked before, and we did it on a 10 by 10 meter scale, so you could rewalk it, see if it's changed and see if it's moving. But actually, Bruce has a paper that's coming out soon, where we actually, the Park Service, and you don't get this very often, when they had Dalmatian toadflax and they did grow it up in the hut right in Mammoth, a few 10, 15 years later, they realized it spread, and they did an inventory. So it wasn't a survey, they walked everywhere, and they drew maps of where these patches were along the roads. And then they went back about another 2 years after and did it again, and it had spread. So we've actually looked at how that distribution was all related to being close to Mammoth. And then in the intervening 40 years, it switched to, now it likes to have south-facing dry slopes, there's not much other vegetation. So we've got the invasion, and then we've got where it was in 2000, and it would be really cool to do it again and see if it's continuing to change or if it's actually saturated the environments that it can invade. Tad?
So I think, and I'm sticking my neck out here, that most of the native plant communities, most natural ones, are mostly perennial. So you were mentioning a pre-emergent is a peg. I didn't get the chemical name. So in that case, if they're perennials, it's not so important that they seed every year. How about, so this is a question, what do you think about spraying in general to damage any annuals that are coming in, like growth tech, without much harm to the perennials? And maybe you need to do that from time to time, as if you were pasteurizing the system. I don't mean grazing, but pasteurization of milk. So think of that in a relative undisturbed case, and then think of another case where you have bad invasion of growth tech. You could have paired fields like that. So first, how about doing it in just being invaded pastures? That makes sense?
Yeah. So I think I could change it, right? Because not everybody heard the question. So Tad's saying that most of the grassland systems that we have around here are full of perennial bunch grasses. So they have deep-rooted systems. They're established and they grow for a lot of years. We don't know how long, but they're there for a lot of years. And they don't have to produce seeds every year. And equally, so therefore, if we go in to control something like cheatgrass, which is an annual, so I didn't explain this in my talk, and I should have. Cheatgrass is the only annual grass that we have. Well, okay, there's ventonata as well, but it's the one that we know best. It germinates in the fall, and it grows all the way through the winter, and that means that as soon as it gets warm enough in the spring, it's there, it's already got its roots established, it's got a few leaves, it uses all the sun and the nutrients it can, and it starts growing really quickly. All of the native grasses are a little bit more clued in to the Montana climate, and they're like, yeah, we're not growing yet. And so cheatgrass can exploit the resources earlier in the spring, and then the perennial grasses get going. So Tad's asking, would it really be harmful to spray something like a mazapic every now and again to knock back the cheatgrass, because the native grasses will come back? Or it doesn't matter if they don't seed in 1 year. I guess not. But I think my answer to that is, we still don't really know, if we're honest. If we have patches, and maybe I'll pick on Coulter's project, he has really, really dense patches of cheatgrass in the Centennial Valley, and they're up on these south-facing slopes. And the managers want to spray these patches, but they're surrounded by all of this nice sagebrush all the way around. And the question is, how well can we target just those patches, and how much impact are we going to be having around that area? And being that that area was grazed for a long time back in the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, there's not very many other species that are present where the cheatgrass is, so what's going to come back? So I think that, so in that situation, I'm not particularly happy with spraying it, because it seems to be quite stable as it is, even if there is a dense patch. But I think there could be other areas that are more disturbed, dare I say Red Bluff, for example, which has had more grazing, more disturbance, more cheatgrass, that maybe doing some management now and again would have less impact, negative impact on other species. But in reality, we don't know that much.
That's sort of what I was trying to do with my two-phase question.
Okay.
I like small plot experiments, and I think that on the drone tag with the small plot, where it's well established, it's really not clear what will happen. Might make it worse. But in the native grass adjacent, shall we say, outside of those patches, if it doesn't have many annex in it, I think it might keep that from coming in. So I think it's a hypothesis. I'm not making any statement about truth or non-truth. It's a puzzle.
The puzzle. I mean, and I think we've had cheatgrass has been here since the 1880. It was first found. In the 1930s, down in the Great Basin, they were like, oh, it's everywhere, we'll just use it as forage. We've been trying to control it since then, and so it's going to take a little bit of time.
All right, thank you. If we didn't get to your burning question, you can enter down in the hall. Thank you for coming. Really appreciate it.